Hello and welcome to Inside Events, an international podcast focused on contemporary issues in events and festivals. This week, I'm joined by Dr. David Jarman from Edinburgh Napier University, and we're going to be talking about networks in the context of events. Thanks for joining us. David, could you tell us a little bit about you, your role, and why are you interested in networks in the context of events?
Hello, Mike. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this video podcast series. I live in Edinburgh. I've been here since the mid to late 90s. I came up here for university. And when I was involved with the university up here, I found myself getting involved in the summer festivals, the Fringe, some of the other bits and pieces going on. And it all kind of gave me insights into what it is to develop a career in the event and festival space. And that kind of saw me through until my mid to late 20s, where I was seeing that other people were being often more successful than me in developing their freelance professional career. And I was kind of wondering, well, where's this going to take me? Fortunately, for me, Edinburgh Napier kind of swept in and said, we have the position, would you like to apply for it? And since then, I've had this academic interest in events and festivals very explicitly. And over a period of time, it's given me the chance to do bits of research around events, festivals, and networks. And I've come out the far end of a PhD in the past 12 months with a sense that if we think about networks and their ways of describing society, of illustrating organizations, of giving us some sense of how an individual perceives the social world around them, then it can be complementary to some of the more what you might consider mainstream or traditional forms of research methodology that we tend to find within the festival, event and tourism field. And I did my PhD on the basis of this kind of starting point, that networks could tell us something about individuals and organizations and societies. Great. But what I also found was that from a social network analysis perspective, here was a wide range of different research methods, techniques, tools, and so on that hadn't really been applied within events and festivals, or at least hadn't really been kind of consolidated. So my PhD was a chance to just say, right, well, what happens if we try a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of something else to try and develop an overall mindset and methodology that can give us something new to complement what we're already doing in terms of events and festivals.
That's a really comprehensive background, and you touch upon kind of conceptual features there of networks in some sense. If we could kind of deep delve a little bit further in terms of the concept of networks, and in particularly to events, how would you, for the listeners that might just be kind of starting off thinking about this concept, might be a first year student or it might be a professional listening to this, who knows? How would you deconstruct, I guess, in a way, the concept of networks?
Well, network-based analysis, as far as I can tell, is about all the sorts of things that we already are interested in. So an individual's journey, an individual's characteristics, their attributes, and all that kind of stuff, that has a place. But where the network side of thing comes in to the fore is in relationships. So if you're doing social network analysis as a formalized network piece of research, for example, then you are looking for nodes. So you're looking for something that you're focusing on. Could be people, could be organizations, places, who knows what. Something, a unit of analysis. You're looking for connections, or perhaps the lack of connection, which can be equally as interesting. And you're looking for contagion. You're looking for something that flows or doesn't flow between a couple of points. So that could be 15 people who've all attended a, social event. And what are their connections in terms of, email exchange, following each other on social media, who knows what. But you've got people, you've got connections, and you've got something that's flowing, or the lack of something flowing. So in its heart, that's it for a network. You can then build that up in some really interesting, intricate ways. some of the most interesting research around festivals and events will be about trying to sort of scratch away at what we might perceive to be on the surface the structure of an organization, and then you say, okay, but what if we, instead of looking at an organizational hierarchy, we say, fine, but what are the actual connections between people? And this is where you might see, for example, within a university, how important the secretaries might be, or the professional services staff, because they're the ones who are dealing with people across all the different academic subjects, or they're dealing with people in all different levels of an organization. And they may not have particularly high prominence. If a dean, for example, was to say, well, here are the things that we're most proud of, and this is how we're structured. But you need those people within a network to actually make these things happen. And the social network analysis, if you ask the right questions and you gather the right data, can start to reveal those sorts of things.
That's fascinating, and it's a complex subject that again we won't be able to talk enough about in detail in this. So hopefully we'll have a follow up to some of the things that you mentioned. But if we think about why people should be interested in the concepts of networks, they might be kind of for academic purposes, or perhaps even for kind of more practical purposes as well. Kind of how would you describe how we'd be? Why should we be interested, or why should we care about this particular area?
I think we should care because social networks shape our lives. And I think over the past 10, 20 years, we've become more aware of this. Social media gives us a daily exposure to our social graph, our social network. If I log on to LinkedIn, then I get told who is a first degree separation contact of mine, who's a second, and potentially who's a third. So I'm getting a sense that, yes, I am the center of my own network, but I'm part of a much, much bigger web of connections and all of that. Likewise, the pandemic, it came along and we could see as it, moved from one country to the next, networks were enabling this virus to spread. So I think on one level, networks are important to us on a human day-to-day level. I think also from an academic perspective, doing a social network-based piece of research can be complementary to, as I say, the more established forms. We see a lot of stakeholder-based analysis in festivals and events. We see, for example, that a piece of work into a given festival organization might identify primary stakeholders and secondary stakeholders. But to my mind, there's something missing if you lump, for example, all of the host community into a single box, if you put the media into another box, if you put performers and employees, if you just say, here is a blob that we're going to call employee, I think that we're missing so much of the nuance there, partly because an individual person is going to be potentially an employee and an audience member and this and that and a member of the host community. Also because people move from one section to the next, from one project to the next. And in our world of festivals and events, it's not like people are static. People are going from one department to another, from one organisation to another. If I start working for the Edinburgh Festival Fringe for 6 months, and then during the winter I go and work for a festival in Australia, I don't suddenly rip up my contact list or I don't chuck my phone in the river and say, well, there you go, I've lost all those contacts. I am still part of the same social network that I was before, and I have all that information with me. So I think it's, yes, complementary to the stuff that we tend to do. From a kind of applied industry perspective, well, I mean, I would suggest that a lot of the time, for better or worse, if you're looking at a festival organization, you're potentially looking at another way of perceiving the organization that you are supposedly in charge of, for example. If I, as a festival director, look upon my staff and I see them in the finance team, the front of house team, the, marketing team, that's great. But unless we ask the people within those teams, who do you actually go to for if you need information, or who actually comes to you for advice, then we're going to miss out on a whole web of connections that I think tell a richer story about what's going on within such a community. Because, for example, if my mate in the marketing team says, "Oh, it would be great, just come and join us in the front of house team. You'll have a wonderful summer working on the festival." Well, that's brilliant, but I don't know anyone in front of house. I go to him and he's over in the marketing team, or I go to another friend because she's in some other team. So it's a hidden kind of layer of connections within an organization that might be completely unknown to the people in charge. And I think that these sorts of bits of research that can be done on a fairly straightforward level, once we get used to the software and everything else involved, can be really rewarding about trying to tell us that richer story of what's going on in a networked environment.
That's really useful. And I'm just thinking about my own research when you were talking there. I've got about 1,000 follow-up questions, but won't be able to get through it. I was just thinking about how creating these homogeneous blobs of networks is a really, really good tool for not addressing the specific needs of people within that blob. Yeah. And so the blob that I'm referring to is at Paris 2024 at the moment, which is dubbed the Community Games.
Okay, ambitious, right? Yes.
Community Games, because they forget about community all the time. Dubbed Community Games, but the French actually reject the notion of community because everyone is part of the French community, right? But we're critiquing it and saying, well, that's very useful to do that, because the very specific communities, the French African communities in the north of Paris, of whom are the target of development in the north of Paris when a lot of the Olympic Park is and everything, their interests aren't being recognized really whatsoever. And it's purely by homogenizing this network of host community, as you mentioned before, that I think is actually a problem. So not understanding the network and its interests and its intricacies enough. It's just yet one of a bazillion examples of how you can apply your stuff. I always take it to mega events. I'm just so boring. I'm so one-dimensional. That's all I focus on. But it gives an example, doesn't it?
You know, the social network analysis literature extends into many, many different areas of academic life these days. And, it has been a growing trend in the past 20 years or so. One of the areas that might be relevant to your context in Paris is that social network-based analysis can help to find otherwise underrepresented or somewhat hidden communities or members of a community. And you can kind of utilize the idea of networks to try and kind of find, well, how are we going to reach people that are very important within a community? Or perhaps within a kind of sub group within society, and yet is relatively hidden or is relatively cut off from the main channels of decision making or resource distribution or uses of otherwise public spaces and other resources. So by thinking in terms of networks and doing research in terms of social network analysis, I think there's ground to be made in a whole range of different contexts.
I agree. And my mind's just going kind of wild, just thinking about how I might use it for my own. One paper that we just wrote was about, I was always interested in the central question of why is it that people's interests, local interests in particular, are so central and celebrated at the very beginning of winning the right to host some sort of event. And then when it comes to live staging, their interests are not that considered that much. It becomes about operationalizing, it becomes about getting the job done, moving on to the next thing, and then the kind of the social responsibilities and everything. And we take a stakeholder salience perspective, which is just simply going, well, they were just stripped of certain attributes that made them salient, right? Power, legitimacy, urgency. And we try to illustrate how they kind of lost all them things. You can easily look at that from a network perspective. They were kind of disconnected from institutions that were empowering them. There's just so many ways in which it could be brought in. Right, okay, we'll go way over time if we follow that rabbit hole. And so I'll stop there. But when we think about the concept of networks and how it's evolved over the last decade and where it will go to, you think, maybe over the next decade, could you kind of chart maybe that trajectory of maybe kind of where it's come from and where it might go to, David?
Yeah, I think that that there's the kind of general understanding that there is the thing called social network analysis, and bits of work are being done in little corners, and then they're kind of being presented in ways that look nice on a conference presentation screen. But does that mean that other people are going to start using the same methods? There is a sort of foundation of that kind of thing. I think also there is perhaps a sense that the software is becoming a little bit easier to access. And although a lot of it is not straightforward from an academic software perspective, I think what we do see more and more of is that some of the social networking sites are becoming keen to sort of show us aspects of our network, and that can be a kind of setting of some of the context at a kind of everyday level. I think over time, what we're also seeing is a little bit more experimentation. And I would hope that in an academic context, this can continue, that people will find that it doesn't take an awful lot to add in some of those relational questions into a survey that can sit alongside maybe work they were already doing. So if you're going out to survey a population of people, then can you find out a little bit more about the relationships between them? So that could give you ways of saying, okay, well, it's not the main focus of what we're up to here, but let's see if we can bring some of that in. I think that there is also a bit more in terms of trying to tell the story to industry professionals so that they are keen to hear that bit about what it might mean to them. As you say, a lot of the job of doing an event is doing the event. So what does it take to provide people with practical information that they might find useful as they try to set out their understanding, perhaps, of the organization of which they are a part? I think also we've got a sense that working in terms of social networks does have an intuitive element to it. If I talk to a freelancer or an events professional and I want them to tell me about their career, then they will say, and this person led me to that opportunity, and here was an organization where I didn't do much, but I found friends who then, came back to benefit me in the future. Then all of these sorts of things are stories that can be told. And if we can frame it in terms of social networks, then I think that kind of opens up a vocabulary and a set of methods and a set of perspectives that can then be enhanced. It doesn't take much, I would suggest, to link social networks to social capital and all the things that we talk about a lot all the time, about building connections, about working in terms of shared experiences, shared values, etc. So I think that it's a bit messy. It's not like there is a central authority defining where we need to go with this. But I think there's opportunities for experimentation and an audience that would find it intuitively accessible.
That's really useful. And the central guiding question of whether events are powerful mechanisms for social change, yada yada yada. A lot of people are kind of questioning. A lot of people think kind of events are being cancelled, postponed, pushed back by populations. Governments are kind of withdrawing bids. They're cancelling entire events like Victoria, the Commonwealth Games. There's this need now to really think about what these things are doing for us, right? And you mentioned social networks and social capital. Social networks might be the method in which to capture some of that kind of those increased connections between people that then might increase social well-being and like and, you can kind of follow that on to its logical conclusion. It's a gap in data. and method and knowledge, isn't it, in some sense, that we don't fully, or we can't fully articulate the benefit of events because they are complex and they do need really specific measures and methods in order to capture it. And we're really at the beginning, don't you think, David, in terms of what we know about the power of events for these sorts of things? Do you agree with that in some sense, or
Yeah,
disagree?
I do. You look at some of the biggest event research projects, and they involve large amounts of money, preparation, building in impact analysis before, during, and after the event, following up, 10 years after it's taken place, that sort of thing. My mind goes to Beatrice Garcia and her work around Liverpool '08 and its hosting of European City of Culture. Massive project. And so when we're trying to capture the value of events, it is very tricky. I think, therefore, that if network analysis has something to add to that, then it can be in the sorts of things we've been talking about. Fine, it's quite intuitive. You can tell an individual person's story. You can also say something about a community. I think it's also worth saying that a wide variety of sources of data are perfectly applicable to social network analysis. It doesn't all have to be set up in advance. If I had the right skills and the right access, then you could use email data to try and define a network. You could use social media data. It's not as though you're starting from zero and sort of saying, right, okay, well, we're going to have to put a survey in place and get, everyone to fill it in and stuff like that. The data is often there, and it's about pulling it together and highlighting the relational nature to it. So, yeah, that's one level. I suppose also there's the perhaps age-old question within our field of, okay, well, who decided it was a good idea for Victoria to host the Commonwealth Games in the first place? Was it open consultation? Was it a small clique of well-connected people who then kind of came face to face with reality when you decided that they couldn't go ahead? How is a rescue bid perhaps going to be launched by another city who feels that in 3 years they could put on the Commonwealth Games? These are all kind of complex questions, and if there's a network dimension to it, then it can help to reflect upon, the relationships, because that's key. Who's involved? What are the connections between them, and what is it that's flowing between those connections?
Sounds like you've got a lot of potential research projects, David.
We all do.
And just kind of thinking about a bit of a final question, really, which is just around resources. If people want to kind of learn about this concept and the application of it beyond this, maybe after they've listened to this video cast, you have your curated collection in event management that will at some point be out in the future. But is there any other kind of resources that you'd specifically suggest go to? And we'll add these to the end of the video as well.
A couple of years ago, Professor Greg Richards and I co-edited a event management special issue on events as networks, platforms, and communities. And that was the result of a strand of papers presented in the Atlas conference in 2018 in Denmark. The intention behind our special issue, as the title suggests, was to try and draw out this idea of events as being part of something often larger. So a community who comes together and suddenly is manifested at an event, or a network which is made real through the experience of being together at an event. So there's that special issue to have a look at. My PhD is a collection of papers. I look at different types of social network analysis. for example, whole networks where we gather data from quite a lot of different people and we get their own perspectives on who they're connected to. There's also ego network analysis that I looked at, where you take an individual person and gain a lot of information from them about how they perceive their network. There's also two-mode social network analysis, where you can have two units of analysis in the same graph, for example, people and events. So you can connect all the people who attended a series of, board meetings or football matches, something like that. And in that type of analysis, no person is directly connected to another. They're all connected to the events that they attended. And it gives you a sense of, okay, how is this kind of event or series of events playing a part in what's going on? I would also suggest that a lot of the social network analysis mainstream textbooks are very accessible, and they often talk through how to carry out the analysis from their own perspective. So, for example, work from Prell, one of her chapters just says, okay, let's take steps 1 to 9. What is it you're trying to achieve? What kind of data might you get access to? How are you going to link it to theory? What are you going to do to present your data initially? And then what further analysis can you do? Fine. Also, you can turn to some of Borgatti's work, where he says, let's look at social network analysis, but let's explicitly say, how can you use UCINet, a piece of software, to carry out this kind of work? And there's more and there's more. So there's work out there, but sometimes you have to kind of look in the cracks. So, for example, within the Richards and Palmer Eventful Cities text, yes, it's 10, 12 years old, but there's bits in there about network analysis sitting alongside kind of stakeholder analysis. Similar in work more recently from Van Nijkerk and Getz, their book on stakeholder analysis of events does have a section on networks where they say, let's look at these kind of alternative complementary strands. So there's work out there, but it's not like we're about to see a kind of network analysis kind of textbook explicitly focusing on events. So there's lots of opportunity for people to find their niche and develop their particular strand.
That's great. Thanks, David. We'll leave it there just because we're out of time. But thank you so much for coming on Inside Events. It's been always a pleasure to talk to you about this stuff. I always leave with lots of ideas, and hopefully people will leave with lots of ideas for their own work as well. But thanks for coming on, and hopefully we'll have you on in the future again.
No, absolute pleasure. And like I say, this stuff is intuitive. People want to talk about their networks. They want to say, I've got friends who have helped me. I remember when I worked with someone 10 years ago, and now that connection is still really valuable to me. And that is the stuff of our industry,
Thanks,
so
David.
yeah, to the future.
That's great. To the future. There we go.